When the Galactic Empire hanged Groom, humanity unleashed Ruth. Prologue. The gallows of Korthos Prime. The execution was broadcast across the stars. Millions of species watched as Groom, the Terran diplomat, was led up the obsidian steps of the imperial gallows. His hands were bound, his face bloodied, yet his eyes burned with defiance. The Galactic Empire, an ancient hegemony of 1,000 races, had deemed him a traitor for refusing their ultimatum. Humanity was to submit or be destroyed. Humanity did not submit. As Groom stood before the noose, the imperial viceroy turned to the cameras. "Let this be a lesson to all who defy the Empire," he declared. "Mankind is but a fledgling race, and it shall be broken like all others before it." The lever was pulled. The galaxy watched Groom's body go limp. The Empire's message was clear, but they had made a fatal miscalculation, for Groom had a sister. And her name was Ruth, the wrath of Earth. The transmission reached Earth within hours. Every screen, every holoterminal, every station played the execution. It echoed across the colonies. It burned into the minds of billions, and then Ruth spoke. She was not a diplomat. She was not a politician. She was a warrior, standing before the United Terran Directorate. Her voice was cold, measured. "The Empire believes it has put an end to us." She paused, looking across the room filled with admirals, generals, and leaders. "They think this is over." She leaned forward. "It has just begun." Within days, the Terran fleets, once hesitant, once held back by fragile diplomacy, mobilized. Ships darkened the void, engines burning like vengeful stars. Humanity had never sought war. But now? Now it would show the Empire why it should have. The Empire's first mistake. The Empire had fought countless wars. It had crushed rebellions, enslaved species, burned worlds. But it had never faced humanity at war. When the first Terran fleets struck the Imperial outposts, they did not send warnings. They did not negotiate. They did not occupy. They exterminated. The world of Tarvix 5, an Imperial stronghold for centuries, was reduced to ash in under 2 hours. Orbital bombardments turned cities into molten slag. Imperial fleets sent distress calls, calls that were never answered. Ruth led the charge herself aboard the Vindicator, her flagship. Her strategies were unlike anything the Empire had faced. She did not fight for territory. She did not fight for survival. She fought for vengeance. The horror of humanity. The war spread like wildfire. The Empire, used to slow, drawn-out conflicts, was overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the human onslaught. On the battlefield, humans did not take prisoners. They did not waste time with diplomacy. They did not care for the old rules of war. Empire officers reported atrocities, imperial nobles dragged from their estates, soldiers executed without mercy, planets razed in retribution. Entire species under the Empire's rule turned against their overlords. Emboldened by humanity's defiance, the Empire had thought itself invincible. Now, it saw the truth. It was merely old. And old things broke when struck hard enough. The fall of the Viceroy. The man who had ordered Groom's execution, the Imperial Viceroy of Korthos Prime, sat in his palace, surrounded by his dying empire. Ruth had made it personal. When her fleet arrived above Korthos, the Viceroy's defenses crumbled within hours. Terran soldiers stormed the capital, slaughtering everything in their path, and then Ruth found him, dragged from his throne. The Viceroy was paraded through the streets, just as Groom had been. But where Groom had met a quick death, Ruth ensured the Viceroy's was slow. The entire galaxy watched as the man who had mocked humanity now wept before it. With a single gesture, Ruth ordered his fate. He was hanged, just as Groom had been. The message was clear: the end of an empire. It took 2 years. 2 brutal, merciless years. But in the end, the Galactic Empire fell. Its worlds lay in ruins. Its fleets were shattered. Its leaders were dead, and at the center of it all stood Ruth. She did not claim a throne. She did not demand tribute. She did not seek to rule. She simply looked upon the wreckage of an empire that had thought itself eternal, and turned her back on it. Humanity had won, but the galaxy would never forget the price of that victory, and it would never, ever forget the name Ruth. The gallows of Galactic Prime. The execution was meant to be a warning. A single man, standing at the gallows on Galactic Prime, surrounded by the elite of the Galactic Empire, his life measured in the final tolls of the ceremonial death bell. They called him Groom, though that wasn't his real name. His real name was lost in the bureaucratic void of imperial records, a human diplomat reduced to nothing more than a label, an example that he had tried to negotiate, tried to speak for humanity, but the Empire did not negotiate with inferiors. So they hanged him. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Groom had a sister, her name was Ruth, and Ruth was coming. Chapter 1, The Signal. Deep within the void, aboard the warship Judgment, Ruth Halstead received the transmission. The Empire, in its arrogance, had broadcast the execution across the stars, a display of power meant to shatter humanity's will. Instead, it awakened something the Empire had never faced before. Ruth watched the footage in silence, her ice-blue eyes fixed on the image of her brother's lifeless body swaying from the Imperial gallows. Around her, the bridge crew of the Judgment waited, tense. They had all known Groom. They had all fought beside him in the early days when humanity first clashed with the Empire. No one spoke. No one needed to. Ruth stood. Prepare the fleet. We're burning Dalvik Prime to the ground. The officers snapped to attention. Humanity had been hesitant before. The war had been a slow, grinding conflict, fought in the shadows, in the fringes of the Empire's territory. Humanity was young, reckless, defiant, but they had never dared strike at the heart of imperial power, not until now. Chapter 2, The Empire laughs. When news of Ruth Halstead's fleet reached the Empire, the High Lords of Dalvik laughed. Pathetic, Lord Voth sneered, swirling a glass of rare Ilvarian wine. A single fleet against the might of the Empire? Let them come. We'll send the remnants back in scrap. His advisors nodded in agreement. Humanity was insignificant in the grand order of the cosmos. A young species, barely a footnote in the Empire's history. The High Lords had crushed rebellions that spanned entire star systems. What was one vengeful woman to them? But then, the bombardments began. Chapter 3, The Storm breaks. The Judgment dropped out of FTL alongside 200 human warships, a force unlike anything the Empire had expected. But it wasn't the numbers that shook Dalvik's defenses, it was the sheer brutality of the attack. Ruth had no interest in conquest. No interest in diplomacy. No interest in anything but vengeance. The first wave of human ships crashed through the orbital defenses like a hammer through glass. Imperial dreadnoughts, designed for methodical warfare, found themselves outmaneuvered by human vessels designed for speed, for adaptability, for killing. The Empire had always fought wars the civilized way. Grand fleets, tactical positioning, drawn-out battles of attrition. Ruth fought like a predator. Within hours, Dalvik Prime was in flames. Chapter 4, The King falls. The High Lords of Dalvik fled to the Imperial Palace, thinking themselves safe behind walls that had never been breached. But Ruth didn't just want their planet. She wanted them, and she would have them. The palace fell under siege, human shock troopers storming the corridors, their rifles singing the song of retribution. Ruth led the charge herself, tearing through guards like a force of nature. Lord Voth, the architect of Groom's execution, was dragged from his throne, his regal robes torn and stained with the blood of his guards. Ruth stood over him, eyes cold. Did you think you could kill my brother and walk away? Voth, trembling, tried to muster the arrogance of the Empire. You think this will change anything? The Empire will crush you. Ruth smiled. The Empire is already burning. And then she dragged him through the streets, the same streets where Groom had been paraded before his execution. The same streets where the people of Dalvik had cheered for his death. Now, they watched in horror as their own ruler was paraded like a trophy, humanity's wrath made manifest. And when Ruth was done, she did not hang him, she let the people of Dalvik decide his fate. The people, knowing what was coming, tore him apart themselves. Epilogue. The Empire trembles. The fall of Dalvik Prime was more than a battle. It was a message. A warning. Humanity had been dismissed. Ignored. Treated as a minor nuisance. Not anymore. When the Galactic Empire hanged Groom, they thought they were killing a symbol of human resistance. Instead, they had created something far worse. They had unleashed Ruth, and Ruth was just getting started.